Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Kaufman. I am the program assistant here at the Roebling Museum. I just want to say welcome again to this really amazing presentation by our Villanova public history graduate, history intern, Weronika Grajdura. Veronica has been with us since May, and she finished her internship with us last week. Very sad. But she wanted to do a live event for everyone to learn about what she's been working on. And she has been researching and going on site and doing a bunch of amazing work to kind of compile the history of churches in Roebling. She will get into that during her presentation, but to get us started, I wanted to give a little bit of an overview about Roebling Museum for people who are not familiar with us. If this is your first time, again, thanks so much for coming. And I'm going to take it away. So if you enjoy this talk and are curious about other talks that we have done in the past, you can access that on our YouTube page. We do monthly Zoom programs. We have 3 series. One series, which the one you're watching today, is called Curator's Corner, which we feature specific artifacts that are in our collection. And artifacts could be photos, 3D objects, whatever, to tell different stories about Roebling that we don't typically hear about. We also have our new research series, or new Roebling research series, where Lynn and I, or occasionally when we have interns who are doing research that is not reflected in the physical museum, we have events to kind of talk about that, uncover the research process, the historical research process. And so we've had a few of those. The topics that we've done have been Black history in Roebling. And then our new research, our previous new research event was with our Rutgers undergrad interns. So they presented on their topics, which was military history in Roebling and love in Roebling. And then our final series is our expert roundtable series. So we bring in an expert to talk about different topics that are central to the Roebling story, but also might not be reflected in the museum. So our expert that we brought in for both of those Zooms was Pierre Lacombe. He's here today. Hey, Pierre. And he talked about the bricks and leaves in Roebling, for one. And then he talked about Washington Roebling's mineral collection. That was actually our event from last month. So if any of those sound interesting to you, please check us out on YouTube. And this event will be on YouTube as well. We will send out a link once it is live on YouTube. And now just a little bit about Roebling Museum before we get started. Roebling Museum is located in northern Burlington County, New Jersey. It is really focused on the John A. Roebling Sons Company, that they established a company town and steel mill in the area that is now Roebling, New Jersey in 1905. And to kind of tell the story of the company, the family, the workers, and the town, we have 4 separate experiences at Roebling Museum. So the first is actually the physical site of the museum. It is up in the left-hand corner of the image here. And in the museum, we have 6 galleries where you'll learn the story of the Roebling family from the very start of John Roebling coming from Prussia to the United States, all the way up until the closure of the Roebling mill in 1974. Then we also have our historic mill yard, which is most of the screen here. We have these amazing steelmaking artifacts that are outside with historical markers where you can walk the former where you can walk the mill yard and where the former scrap yard was, and read about the process from scrap metal to wire rope. And then we also have our company town, which we consider to be a part of the museum because we engage with the company town every Saturday at 1 p.m. with a company town walking tour. The tour is about an hour. It's a half-mile walk and you'll get to see all of the crucial parts of social life and labor in Roebling from the years that it was a company town from 1905 to 1947. And we also walked down to the beautiful Delaware River to talk about kind of the environmental ramifications of the plant as well. And then forthcoming in March of 2028, we also have our Roebling row house experience. The museum purchased the house directly across the street, and we're actively researching and in order to convert the museum or convert the house into a historic 1930s, 1940s era row house museum, kind of similar to what the Tenement Museum does, but it will be different. And I almost said better, but that's not here, neither here nor there. But that is coming in March of 2028. So definitely stay tuned. As we get closer, we'll keep posting more and more updates about that. But it will be a really wonderful experience to kind of round out our everything that we have to offer. And then finally, I will stop talking very soon. But I wanted to promote our next Doom program, which will be happening on August 25th. And it will be all about how you can research your own row house if you are a Roebling community member. We do small research projects for people in the community who are like, who lived in my house? What's the story? Do I have ghosts? Typically, people want to know if they have ghosts or spirits in their house. And so we want to kind of do a live demonstration of what that actually would look like and share more about how you can kind of uncover the secrets of your house. So if that sounds interesting to you, you should definitely scan the QR code on the slide to sign up, or I will actually put the link in the chat once I give it over to Veronica. So thank you so much for listening. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and allow Veronica to teach us all about churches in Roebling.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, for the great introduction. As Sarah said, my name is Veronika. I just graduated from Villanova's History MA program with a concentration in public history. I'm not originally from the area. I'm originally from the suburbs of Chicago, which is something that me and Sarah both share. And then I completed my undergrad at St. Louis University. And so I was really drawn to Roebling because, for those of you who don't know, Roebling is really a town that was started by Eastern European immigrant families. A lot of the families that came to live in the company town were from that background. And a lot of my previous research interests have to do with immigration and immigrant communities. Specifically, I look at often at Polish communities because I am of Polish descent. So that's kind of why I was really drawn to Roebling, both as the town and the museum. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the churches and religious life in town. Something I want to preface is that this history isn't something that's really hidden. In fact, it's something that's very real and lived and remembered by the local community, and there's still people that attend these churches. And so this history is available through a variety of different means, be it through published church histories or through the memories of the people who still attend. And so, likewise, there are other details in these stories that we aren't quite completely sure about. And so, if anyone has any information on the churches or has any interesting stories to share, I'd really be interested in hearing more about it. And so, before I actually get started, I also wanted to give a special thank you to a lot of the community members who helped out with this project. Lynn, Sarah, and I were able to actually go in person to visit a lot of these churches. So I wanted to thank Lou Borby, Joe Varga, and Marianne Yersijan for opening up their churches for us. And I also wanted to thank our volunteers, Nancy Podeswa and Ann Sable, for fielding my many, many questions that I had about these different churches. And so I'm going to start off with a brief intro to all of these churches, talk about each individual church history. Then I'm going to talk about the wider role of churches within the Roebling community. And then I'm going to kind of talk about the topic of cultural maintenance and ethnic revival and how it's seen through these different churches. Here on this slide, I have all of the different denominations that you can find within Roebling. And so some of these may be very familiar to you all, others less so. But I think the big takeaway here is that a lot of these churches have very strong ethnic ties. They're founded by these immigrants who are living in Roebling. And so that's really reflected in both the people who are attending these churches and how they are practicing their different faiths. And so to geographically situate us in Roebling, I have this historic map from 1919. Here is a bit of an index where you can get a bigger bird's eye view of Roebling. So here in the red is where the steel mill would have been located. In the yellow, that's the boundaries of the company town. So within those streets, that's where the Roebling Company constructed all of its residencies, as well as a few different communal buildings for the town. So that would be the thing like the general store and the boarding houses. But Roebling wasn't just confined to those barriers. Rather, it also grew on the outskirts. So here we have a close-up of the green section, which kind of continued to develop as the town went on. And so here you can find a lot of the different local local businesses that would have served the community, and you can also find the churches being built in this area. And so this area was also outside of the company control, so the company didn't have any really formal relationship with these churches, and so these churches really develop on those outskirts. And so here we have St. Mary's Church, St. Nick's, and then we also have the Hungarian Reformed Church present in this part of town. To give us an even fuller bird's eye view, those maps don't capture everything within the town. And so we also have churches still within within the borders of Roebling, but still developing kind of more on the outskirts. So here we have Trinity Methodist Church and Holy Assumption, which are on Hornberger Avenue, kind of towards the direction of Florence, which is the town right next to Roebling. And then also over here on Railroad Avenue, we have Tabernacle Baptist Church, which is marked by the 81 on the map. So the first church that we were lucky enough to visit was the Hungarian Reformed Church. And this, Joe Vargo was very gracious in showing us around this church. And so the Hungarian Reformed Church really started in 1907 when a group of Hungarians in town who practiced the Reformed faith met up together to worship together. First, they worshiped at an unspecified residence, and then later they moved to a general store called the Waco store. I was able to find an obituary for a John A. Waco who moved to Roebling in around 1921 and who operated a general store. But it mentioned that this would have been after the church building was constructed. So if anyone has any more details about this, we'd love to learn generally about the store or just more about the church in general. And so the foundation for the church started to be laid a few years after that in 1913. Notably, a lot of the churches in town also have strong relationships with other local churches in bigger towns and cities. For the Hungarian Reformed Church, there's a different Hungarian Reformed Church located in Trenton who had been built a few decades before. And so they really have a strong relationship with the Roebling Church. They both shared the same pastor. And so the pastor would travel in between church for services on the weekend. Something that I also think is a very interesting thing to note about these different churches and denominations are is the language that these people are praying in, they're preaching in, they're having religious services in. So when these immigrants are first coming to Roebling, most of them don't really speak a lot of English. And so that is reflected in the churches themselves. And so here we have a songbook from the Hungarian Reformed Church, which is still at the church today. And so it's written in Hungarian because that's what they would have prayed in. But gradually, as new generations are being born in Roebling, there isn't quite as strong of a linguistic tie to these original languages. Rather, kids are being educated in English. Oftentimes, English is becoming their stronger language, and there isn't as much of a formalized attempt to teach these different languages in town. Most people kind of have some knowledge of the language from their grandparents or our parents, but it's not often that you'll find someone who's still very fluent in these languages. And this is still something you can track through the churches. We know at Hungarian Reformed Church, it's around 1948 when services in English are really introduced. And then by 1975, this church has its first non-Hungarian speaking pastor. And so by that point, services are mostly in English, with a few exceptions of a few songs and prayers that would still be in Hungarian. And this isn't just exclusive to the Hungarian Reformed Church. You can find this trend kind of happening in other churches in Roebling and also just ethnic churches in general across the US. The next church that we were able to visit with Lou Borby was the St. Mary's Catholic Church. Similar origins in terms of the church started with a meeting of different people in town who were talking about really finding a church that kind of matched their different religious needs. And so this meeting happened on November 17th, 1912, and it was also with the help of Reverend Dr. Lucacci, who helped establish St. Basil's the Great in Trenton, that St. Mary's really was able to hit the ground running and get started as a congregation. Before the church building was erected, services were being hosted in the boarding house, and then land for the church was finally purchased in 1913. And then it took a few years, and then the church was completed and consecrated in 1917. But St. Mary's continued to expand over the century. In 1919, they purchased a cemetery tract that's along US 130. They also built a parish hall in 1929, and then a rectory was dedicated in 1971. The next church that we visited with Mary Ann was St. Nick's, which is the oldest permanent church structure within Roebling. And so St. Nick's is a Greek Catholic church. So a lot of the Byzantine Rites families in town would go to this church. But before that, they would commute into Trenton to attend St. Mary's Greek Catholic Church, which still has a very strong relationship with St. Nick's today. And so after a while, these Byzantine Rites families kind of got tired of commuting to Trenton. The train and trolley schedules were infrequent, which I'm sure we can all relate to. And then it also just started to cost a little bit too much money. And so they got together to talk about starting their own congregation in town. And so initially, services were held above the drugstore on 4th Avenue and were later moved to Horner Hall, which was on Alden Avenue at some point, but we don't have a lot of information about Horner Hall. It was finally in 1914 that the church was completed, and then by 1915, the church purchased a cemetery, and then they had a rectory blessed in 1928. Unfortunately, in 1945, St. Nick's suffered a fire. During that time, they had to have services in St. Mary's, but luckily, St. Nick's was able to kind of bounce back better than ever. The next church that we have, unfortunately, we weren't able to visit this church in person, but Nancy was very gracious in providing us some photos of what it looks like in the modern day. So here we have Holy Assumption, which is another Catholic church in town. Similar story, a group of people meeting in town want to start a church. And so in 1912, this group of Hungarian men goes into Trenton to speak with Bishop McFowle about organizing a parish. Originally, Bishop McFowle was a little hesitant. He was worried that the parish wouldn't be really financially feasible, and he felt like there were a lot of other churches that the local Hungarians could go to, either St. Clare's in Florence or some other churches in Trenton. However, the church history notes that it was a group of women who were, quote, far shrewder than the men that finally were the kind of pushing point. They went to talk to the bishop, and he was finally convinced in starting a parish in Roebling. And so initially he agreed to allow a reverend to come down every third Sunday of the month to host services in the boarding house. When these services first started being hosted in June of 1913, Holy Assumption was actually being called St. America's Hungarian Church. Later, in around 1919, when the land for the church was donated, they chose to change the name in order to kind of go away from the national ethnic ties and hopefully attract more Catholics of regardless what ethnic background to the church. And so luckily, Holy Assumption was finally completed and opened up in 1922 with a school opening up a little bit afterwards. Our next church that we have is Trinity Methodist Church. Similar to the other churches group, it started off in 1907 with cottage prayer meetings and also a Sunday school that was hosted for the local people. Before the erection of the church building, Trinity Methodist used several different sites in town, including the site of the former U.S. Post Office, as well as the space above the pharmacy. Finally, in 1919, the church was able to purchase land to get construction going, and they really credit the work of the Ladies' Aid Society at Trinity Methodist for helping with the fundraising for the church. Unfortunately, the Great Depression happened. Construction was kind of pushed back because of finances, but luckily, the church was constructed and completed in 1935. Something that's really interesting is that in Ken Ibach's oral history, he talks a little bit about the construction of the church. He mentions that when he was a high schooler, he and some of the other high school boys got permission from the contractor to work on the church on the weekend. So they had got to do little tasks like piling up the bricks and working on the scaffolding and all of that. So that's kind of an interesting little tidbit. Another interesting story from Trinity Methodist actually comes from 1974. This is when the CF&I plant, the Colorado Fuel and Iron plant, which took over the Roebling steel mill, they were closing at that time, and then a local resident who attended the church and was also a worker at the steel plant or iron plant, sorry. He managed to convince the company to donate a bell from one of the original 1906 steam engines so they can use it in the church. Unfortunately, there was a report that the bell was stolen for a bit, so that's really kind of an interesting mystery. The last church that we have today is the Tabernacle Baptist Church, which served the Black community of Roebling. Unfortunately, we don't really have a formal history of this church, as this is the only church that is no longer active in Roebling. We do know that it generally operated in the 1930s and 40s, and there are a few different pieces that we do have from the church. For example, there are quite a few oral histories that mention the church. Here we have a quote from Lula Jenkins, who talked about attending the church and Sunday schools. As she said, it was really nice. And she also kind of reminisced about playing behind the church as a kid. There's also a different oral history from a man named Wilbur Henry, who lived in Roebling in around 1919 to 1921, who stated that before Tabernacle Baptist, the Black community would meet for services in the basements of one of the other churches in town. However, we aren't quite sure which of those churches it would have been. But we do have some surviving photographs. So we have the exterior of the church as well as the inside with some of the members of the church. And then we also have a photograph of their pastor, who is Reverend Edmund Alexander. The other information that we get about Tabernacle Baptist comes from this society column that was published in the Afro-American, which is a rather famous Black newspaper based out of Baltimore. And it was written by a woman who lived in Roebling named Mrs. Liller Bennett. And so here on the left, you have her talking about an Easter service that was planned at Tabernacle Baptist, including an Easter egg hunt, which is always really fun. And then here on the right, you have her talking about a play that was put on at the church by some of the local youth. But like I said, unfortunately, this church no longer exists. We're not quite sure what happened to the church. We've heard some stories that it was demolished. We've heard other stories that there was a fire. But this is kind of what is left on the lot. And as you can see, there are still peaks of the original foundation of the church. So next, I'm going to kind of talk about the role that these churches played within Roebling. And one of the questions that kind of kept on coming up was, what was the company's influence on these churches? As I mentioned quite a few times already, the company allowed, there were different communal spaces in town that these congregations and denominations used before the church buildings were formally erected. And so the Roebling Company was okay with people kind of forming their own religious groups and kind of using communal spaces in town. In terms of monetary contributions to these churches, we have kind of a range of different opinions and stories. For example, the Hungarian Reformed Church, they received a donation of a girder, which is part of the metal support system of the church that was received from the Roebling Company. There's also a bit of a local legend that $500 was donated to each of the congregations to help them get started up. But the only church history that mentions this donation is St. Nicholas. So I'm not quite sure if this donation was extended to all the churches, and it kind of, I know it draws a lot of questions for me about why some might have received donations and why others might have not. And so the last kind of example we have is from Carl G. Roebling, who was president of the company. I believe he was president from around 1918 or 1919 until his death in 1921. And he also, it said that he gave a donation to Trinity Methodist to help get them started up. But again, it's kind of this interesting question of did they have, did the company have much of an influence on these churches? For the most part, it seemed like they really allowed these congregations to kind of um, meet and kind of develop on their own independently. Something that is also very important to churches and community life is that they provide an avenue for a lot of different events, both religious and non-religious. So the people in town, they would have gotten their baptisms at these churches, they would have gotten married at these churches, and then also funerals were hosted at these churches. But here I wanted to talk about one of the celebrations that I thought was most interesting, being the Easter celebration. Specifically, in a lot of Catholic Eastern European traditions, you have the assembling and the blessing of the Easter basket. So typically on Easter, the family gets together and then they fill a basket filled with a bunch of different foods. This can range from decorated eggs to different meats, butter, things like salt and horseradish, and then they go to church and get it blessed by the priest. And so then the family can enjoy blessed food for Easter. And so in these pictures, you can see some action shots of the Roebling community doing this practice. So you can see the Sable family over on the right enjoying their blessed Easter basket. You can also take a peek into the basket here. You can definitely make out some bread and some eggs. And also what was very typical is for there to be some type of decorative cloth to put over the basket while it's in transit to protect the items within. And then over on the left, you have a photograph from the Borby family of one of these Easter blessings in action at St. Mary's. And so you can see everyone there with their baskets, and then the priest is blessing it. And then typically they'd also sprinkle holy water both on the baskets and the crowd that was present. Another really relevant and interesting Easter tradition was pisanki, which is a traditional Eastern European egg art. And so artists make these eggs by putting on layers of wax onto these different eggs and then dipping them in different colored dyes. And so after layers and layers and layers, you finally end up with these really beautiful decorated eggs. And so here on the left, we have an article from the St. Nicholas Church News talking a bit about this art. And it was also going to be demonstrated at one of the festivals that was going to happen in Roebling. Something that's also really important to note is that these were religious institutions, but they didn't just have a religious use. They often also had some kind of educational use. So most of these churches provided some type of Sunday school or religious education classes, especially for the youth in town. And so on the left here, we have another society column talking a bit about Sunday school at the Tabernacle Baptist Church. And then here in the middle, we have a clipping from Hungarian language paper based out of Trenton about the Hungarian Reformed Church. And so, as you can see on the translation, they had several different services that they were offering, both a Hungarian one and an English one, as well as several different schools, such as a Sunday school and then also a Hungarian school. I think the Hungarian school is especially interesting. We don't have too much information about that, although Joe Varga did confirm that the Hungarian school did exist. But I think it's just really interesting, especially early on in Roebling's history. You see the company is offering Americanization classes so that these immigrants that are coming over, they can have the opportunity to learn English and also kind of adjust to American culture. And then here, a few decades later in 1950, you see a Hungarian school, which is kind of trying to preserve the language and preserve the traditions um, of Hungarian. And so, in terms of the most kind of the most complete or not complete, the most organized instance that we see of some type of school by these churches is from Holy Assumption. And so here we have some photographs from the year that the Holy Assumption School opened. And so that would have been a standard Monday through Friday, pre-K through eighth grade school that operated in Roebling. And it's also interesting because it gives parents in Roebling the opportunity to choose between the Roebling Public School or the Holy Assumption Private School. And so here we can see some of the children with the nuns who would have been their teachers, as well as within the school, within the classroom. I just really love seeing all these pictures that the kids would have drawn that are being hung up on the walls. And so originally, the school at Holy Assumption opened in 1923, and it had about 170 pupils in four classrooms in the basement of the church, which is pretty packed. It's pretty crowded. Um, and then the church building or the school building wasn't opened until around 1957. Unfortunately, at some point in around 1938, the attendance at the school had went down to 52 pupils, and so the pastor of the church and the diocese in Trenton were really debating closing the school. However, the parents of the children kind of got together and said, no, the school is really valuable. We really want the school here, and so they were willing to keep the school open. Next, I'm going to kind of talk about the topic of cultural maintenance and ethnic survival and how these churches really serve as a way to keep different immigrant traditions well and alive in Roebling. And so, in around the 1970s and 1980s, you have these churches, especially St. Nick's, who had a new priest at the church named Reverend Austin Moorbacher, who was really interested in asking these questions about ethnic survival. This is a town that was started mostly by Eastern European immigrants, and how do we hold on to those roots? How do we hold on to those traditions? And so you get a lot of articles within the St. Nick's Church News kind of emphasizing this and emphasizing the importance of holding on to one's ethnic traditions. Likewise, this wasn't just isolated to Roebling. This was kind of part of a larger national trend. In the 1970s, that was when the bicentennial was happening. It was America's 200th birthday. People were really emphasizing looking back on the nation's history, but also on one's own family history. During that same time, in 1977, you see the TV show Roots become really popular. And that TV show looked at the creator Alex Haley's family all through six generations, from when his family was enslaved in Africa, all through the subsequent generations, um, living through major events in US history. And so Roots is one of the things that's really credited with kind of starting this genealogical buzz in the US during this time. So in Roebling, kind of how ethnic revival and cultural maintenance manifested itself is through these different ethnic festivals that were hosted. Likewise, one of the other efforts that St. Nick's did was the Village Home, which was essentially a replica of a traditional Eastern European home. It would have been decorated with different antiques as well as traditional Eastern European arts. And it would have been open for the public to view during the different festivals and the whatnot. So here we have some of the different festivals that were being hosted. These ones are specifically from St. Nick's. So we have some festivals that are kind of more localized in their theming. For example, we have the Brooklyn Bridge Festival, which kind of focused on the history of the Roebling Company and kind of connecting with that aspect of heritage. Then we have more ethnically based festivals such as the Hungarian Festival and the Carpathian Mountain Festival. One that kind of really sticks out is the Jewish Festival. Roebling isn't really known for having a large Jewish population. I think us at the museum only really confirmed that we found one family who lived in Roebling during the 1910s. They were called the Stern family. They owned a general store in town, but other than that, Roebling isn't really known for having a large Jewish population. And so you might ask, why a Jewish festival? This was actually one of the first Jewish festivals hosted in the US by a Christian church. And so, really, Father Austin Moorbacher was interested in this concept of unity and bridging the world. One thing he did that I think was kind of funny was they submitted a letter to President Reagan encouraging to host a summit in Roebling between the Soviet Union and the US because he believed that the Eastern European um, origins of Roebling was a great way to bridge the new world with the old. And so this Jewish festival was another example of this, kind of this promotion of unity between the Jewish faith as well as the different Christian faiths. Some of the festivals that I thought were really interested that I want to highlight. Here we have the 4th of July Festival that would have been hosted in 1976. So this would have been Roebling's, this would have been the America's bicentennial and specifically Roebling's way of celebrating it. So it was hosted in honor of Major General John Puste, who was born in Roebling, and then he went on to have a very significant career in the military. And so here you can see some of the events that would have been hosted, which included a church service as well as freedom exhibits, kind of referencing more so the bicentennial. And then it was also, there was music and dancing and food, all things very typical of a festival in Roebling. Some of the other festivals that I thought were interesting to highlight is the Coal Cracker Crust Festival, which pays homage to the coal mining roots that many families in Roebling had. In fact, if you look at some of the worker records, sometimes you can find mentions of different injuries that some of the workers sustained from coal mining. And so that's kind of just a friendly nod to this origin. Another festival that I thought was really interesting in 1983, they had the Hungarian Shootout. And so there was a bit of a friendly competition between Roebling and New Brunswick. Basically, the two towns were arguing over who was more Hungarian. The argument was that Roebling had a higher percentage of Hungarians, with around 50% of the population being Hungarian. Meanwhile, New Brunswick only had about 7% of its population being Hungarian. However, since New Brunswick is a bigger area and has a larger population, that would have made out for just more Hungarians in general. So they decided to host this competition and they decided to settle this through a bacon bread eating competition. And so, for people who aren't familiar with bacon bread, it's a Hungarian delicacy that you can also find in Roebling. It consists of a piece of rye bread topped with sizzling bacon grease, as well as some chopped green peppers and onions, and sometimes tomatoes. So, I'm not quite sure who won the competition, but I definitely know who I would have placed my bets on. The bacon bread leads us into this very interesting conversation about the role of food within both the churches and the community. Oftentimes, I find that in a lot of immigrant communities and spaces, food tends to be the traditions that really stick around. It's hard to learn a foreign language, especially when you're not speaking it constantly or you're not being taught it in school, but enjoying food from your grandmother or grandparents or parents and then learning how to make it and passing it on is a bit easier. And also, there's kind of this nostalgia factor around food. So here we have some photographs of the ladies of Holy Assumption working hard to make some great Hungarian pastries for the um, bake sale that they would host every Saturday. And so these traditions weren't just within the churches, but also penetrated within the homes as well. And so you can see from Lou Borby's family, they also enjoyed making kiflis as a way to kind of connect with their roots and also just to enjoy some fun pastries. So here are some more examples of kind of food traditions within Roebling and within the church spheres. Here we have the infamous bacon bread that I was talking about earlier. St. Nick's also often posted things about different gourmet clubs, gourmet dinner clubs that they hosted, as well as different recipes. I also know that the Hungarian Reformed Church publishes their own um, cookbook on different Hungarian foods. So I would definitely recommend you to check that out. And then one year at a festival, I think is a really interesting story. They typically, a pig roast was pretty common at these different festivals, but one year they ran out. And so they wanted to kind of make sure that didn't happen again and wanted to just make the festivals bigger and better than before. And so they hosted a ox roast. So, food is really something that kind of stays consistent within these churches and also within the Roebling community. As you can see, Hungarian Reformed Church, home of the world famous kielbasa makers. Other churches in town are also very well known for stuffed cabbage and pierogies. And so, this is kind of what the churches in Roebling in the modern day are really known for, is for providing these great meals that you can eat at kind of the local events and festivals. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to my presentation. I had a really fun time researching the different churches in town. I personally grew up going to a Polish church, so this was very nostalgic for me to think about the ties that these churches have in terms of ethnicity, and it was just really great to learn about everything from the community members. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Veronica. We had a few questions in the chat that we could get started with, but I wanted to encourage folks, if you have a question that you didn't write down during the presentation, to put that in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we will be on here until 7:30 answering questions. So the first question I saw was from Martha, and she asked, it came up when you were talking about Holy Assumption, but what was the ethnicity, if any, of St. Clair's?
St. Clair's, I'm not completely sure about. I didn't do too much research on it since it was in Florence, and so I really wanted to stick to the churches we had in Roebling, but I have to guess it would probably be Hungarian or Romanian.
Great. And then let's see. Somebody else asked about burying loved ones. So, can you actually talk a little bit about the cemeteries that are associated with some of the churches that you talked about?
Yeah, so a lot of the different churches, most of them have some type of cemetery plot. I know that St. Nick's has its own dedicated one, as well as St. Mary's. As I mentioned, they have them. I know at least two of the cemeteries are located on Route 130, 120, I think 130, which is kind of the big major road right before you enter the town. And then there are other cemeteries that we're not quite sure about. I know, Sarah, you might have to remind me of the name, but I know there's a cemetery in Florence in which we know that some of the Black folks in Roebling were buried in, and I believe some of the people from Trinity Methodist. And so I think it really kind of, some churches have their own dedicated spaces, while others kind of use more community spaces for burying their dead.
And Holy Assumption has its own cemetery too.
Yes, that too.
Lynn, do you know the name of that cemetery that Veronica was talking about?
Cedar something, Cedar Hill, I
Yes,
think.
Cedar Hill.
It's right behind the Wawa today.
Uh, Another question. This actually might be a question for Lynn. Who owns the lot that Tabernacle Baptist Church used to sit on?
I don't know. I tried to look into it, but got distracted. I have just been assuming that the guy who owns and or lady who owns the house on the end of that row of row houses also owns it, but I really don't know. There's some evidence that the company had something to do with it previously. So I think that we can actually look that up using the county's records. So I'm going to write that down, Leah. And if you want to help me with it, Leah, let me know.
The another question came up about a church that was not part of the presentation, which is a topic that has come up in the office when Veronica was preparing. The Romanian church on 6th Street and Hamilton Avenue, is that not considered Roebling?
So we definitely had a conversation about what churches are in Roebling because there's the historic village of Roebling, the area where the churches are today, that was outside of the company town. So technically, is that even Roebling?
Yeah.
So we had to make a choice. We had to mark down some things on a map. But the Romanian church on Sixth is really interesting to us. It has like a big dome on the top. It looks really cool. And they also have one of the cemeteries on Route 130 that's down further towards the Quick Check, not to keep talking about places I get coffee, but that one is called the Orthodox Romanian Cemetery. It's a little smaller, but that is the cemetery that's connected to the Romanian church on 6th. We should go knock on the door and introduce ourselves to them. I haven't, a lot of our volunteers and people who've been involved with the museum over the years, they, are members of the community. And I've been asking about it and haven't found anybody who attends there. But I'm sure there's got to be someone in town that can help us, if not just going and introducing ourselves.
And then we have another question about Tabernacle Baptist Church. If it was housed in the rec hall that the company built for Black residents. I can take this one. Um, there's a bit of confusion, I think, about what building was the rec hall and what building was the church. There were two buildings. The picture that Veronica included in her presentation, that was the church, and it was formerly a building that the company used for to store like a fire hose, because on the postcard it says like fire building 3 or something on the in the bottom corner. It does not say Tabernacle Baptist Church. And then there was another building that was the recreation hall. because in oral histories with people, they talk about them as two separate spaces. There is never a point where they say, "Oh yeah, the rec hall turned into the church on Sunday."
Well,
It was
actually, so this is something that Sarah and I talk about a lot. We've pulled every map and we had like a little showdown in the office to figure out because there's oral histories. We have some information for Lou from Lou Borby. We have there was a woman in her 90s who came to the museum, Doris Dobbins. She actually lived in the church when it was converted into houses afterwards, or it was the rec hall. Like we're really, we have like, all of these programs that we've been doing about the new and emerging research. It's really about us trying to figure out the answers to these questions and asking people who are from the area to help us to fill in the gaps. So it's unclear, but we do have this, that remember that work order that said to build screens for the rec hall and a pulpit. That was for the rec hall, I think. It wasn't for a firehouse. So long story short, come back and check in with us on this question in the future, Martha. Thanks for asking.
any other questions that people have? Please feel free to keep them coming. While we wait for more questions, Veronica, would you mind sharing maybe like what was your main takeaway from interning at Roebling Museum?
Um, I think something that always comes up is that history is hard, and I think Roebling is really one of the places where the community is at the center of the museum and is at the center of the history that's done here. And so I really enjoyed it. Felt like every day I was in the office, there was someone new from the community to meet, which I really enjoyed, and hearing just all the different aspects about the history in Roebling. But kind of as Lynn and Sarah's conversation about the Black church versus the Black rec hall, sometimes history is hard to track because people don't realize that they're in history at that very moment. But nonetheless, I think Roebling is a really interesting place and it's been a very awarding experience.
And one of the reasons that we sort of pushed her towards doing this project is because we are trying to, we do a walking tour of like the village part, with the general store and stuff every Saturday, but we're writing one for the side of town where the other row houses are, Amboy and Railroad, and then where the churches and all the businesses used to be. So we're doing the research, so hopefully we can launch that next year so that we can get even more history out. So if you live in any of those areas or know anything about those places, be in touch.
And with our remaining time, Veronica, would you mind maybe giving an abbreviated discussion of the different religions in the community? Because we started with that slide showing the churches slash religions reflected in the churches. So would you mind kind of talking us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I can pull up the slide again if it's helpful for people. Um, this is always something that kind of puzzles me as well. I think religion is very interesting in terms of which denominations do what, and I always get a little confused. But here we kind of have the denominations again. So we have Catholicism, which would have been Holy Assumption and St. Mary's, although I've seen some things that suggest that St. Mary's also kind of followed some Byzantine Eastern rites. So, but community members who actually go there could totally correct me if I'm wrong. And then we have the Byzantine Catholics, who were kind of this combination of the two. And so they followed a lot of the Byzantine Eastern rites. But at some point, there was like a group of priests that were in the Carpatho Mountain region, and which, for those of you who don't know, that's kind of like Slovakia, lower Poland, kind of that mountain area. And they got together in like in like the 15th century and were like, we're gonna keep on doing um, the Eastern traditions, but we're going back to the Pope. And so that's kind of the origins of Byzantine Catholics. It was really kind of interesting, especially since Roebling had a lot of Slovak immigrants. That's kind of where that comes from. Hungarian Reformism was also a really interesting one. Where it's a form of Lutheranism that kind of started in Hungary in the 16th century, during the time that Lutheranism and Calvinism and all those different Protestant reformations were spreading around Europe. And so it took hold in Hungary. But unfortunately, Hungarian reformism went through a lot of periods of persecution. Um, so something that I didn't mention was if you go to the Hungarian Reformed Church, on the pews, they have a star engraved there instead of using a cross or anything. And so that was a way to identify themselves in as being a Hungarian reformist during these periods of persecution. So it identifies them, but it also kind of hides them from the people who were seeking to persecute them. And then we also have the Methodists and the Baptists, which people are probably familiar with. They're kind of denominations that are very present in the US in terms of more Protestant-leaning ones, especially the Baptists. You often see kind of literature about the Baptists in terms of Black communities in Roebling, so or the U.S. So it's kind of not surprising to see that the Black congregation in Roebling was Baptists. So I think that's. Does anyone have any questions about the congregation about the different religious denominations?
Martha asked, was the Methodist Church identified with any particular ethnic group?
I didn't really find anything that pointed me towards that. It's really hard to tell. We don't have the lists of who attended the Methodist Church. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of the primary sources from the Methodist Church. So it's kind of hard to tell who would have attended that church.
Glad you asked. One group of people that we didn't directly speak about are the Swedes. And where
Oh
did
yeah.
Swedes go to church? So there is the nine original Swedish families that moved to Roebling. There was more than that in town eventually. But there isn't like a Swedish church specifically. So every time a person with even a remotely Swedish name reaches out to us, I ask them where their family went to church. And I've also been looking up, we've been able to do a good amount of research with death announcements because they usually list where the person's being buried or where their services are going to be held. And we had one visitor to the museum bring in a baptism. Is that what it was? You were there, I think, Sarah. It was like a beautiful document with all kinds of colors and everything, and the names of the family on there. And they were going to the Methodist Church in Roebling, so there could have been some Swedish folks going there. But I've also heard that they were Presbyterian. So one of the things that I said to Veronica is like they're like people could go to churches in other towns. So not every person who lived in Roebling went to one of these Roebling churches as well. So there was a trolley in town. People had access to. We know the woman who wrote the diaries, the diary writer, lived on 8th Avenue in Roebling. She went to her childhood church in Burlington City, whereas her husband, who grew up in Florence, he went to Florence in his childhood. Church. So I think there's way more stories. We were really looking specifically at the buildings for this, but definitely we want to hear all of your stories. If you have other information, I bet a lot of you have photos that we could scan to learn more and see more images. Certainly about festivals, there's lots of festival photos out there, I bet. So please, everyone, be in touch.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. We're going to wrap up the program, but if you really enjoyed listening to Veronica's presentation, she actually has an interview that I did with her out on our new blog. So we have a blog on our website now. It is in the works still, but every time we have an intern, we want to kind of have an article for them about whether it's an interview, something that they wrote about their experience. And so that can be found if you visit our Explore tab on our blog and just go all the way down to blog. Um, I'm happy to share that when I send out the link when it's on YouTube as well. But thank you so much for coming, everyone. We hope to see you at our next program. And as always, thanks so much for supporting the museum. Have a great night.